Today I'm going to show you my take on a modern sling chair. Right off the bat, I want to say that this is not my original design. I am copying the amazing work of Justin Nelson of Fernway Woodworking. This was a project where I wanted to try out a new skill, using my angle grinder and a cut-saw disc to do some shaping. I hope you enjoy. My first step was to make some templates for the pieces of the chair. I did this by drawing out on some 1/4 inch plywood the side profile. I really just kind of eyeballed this part, and in hindsight, the one thing that I should have done differently was to have the backrest leaning back at a little bit more of an angle. This one was at about 100 degrees, but pushing it back to 110 or 115 would have been a little bit better in the final product. The only piece of this template that I'm going to use for routing is the stretcher that connects the front and back legs as well as the backrest all together. So while it was important to draw the entire thing, I'll use measurements and a tapering jig to cut all of the other pieces. With the template drawn out, I cut it out using my bandsaw. I finally bit the bullet, so to speak, and bought the Rikon 10-326, and I honestly couldn't be happier with it. Not sponsored. I try to cut close to the line on the template and then clean up any rough edges on my oscillating sander. Now that I had the template cut out, I turned my attention to milling up all of the white oak that I was going to need. I'm starting with 8/4 stock, and after milling it ends up being about 1 3/4 inches thick. I first took a large offcut that I had from a previous project and cut it into strips for legs at the bandsaw. Then I head to the jointer to get a flat face and one perpendicular edge on all of my pieces. Oh, the slow motion jointer shot. What a beauty. Once I have that flat face and perpendicular edge, I take all of the pieces to the planer to plane them down to final thickness. Like I said earlier, it ended up being about 1 3/4 inch. To finish off the milling process, I take my pieces to this table saw to cut them to the right width. I played around with a few different pieces to make sure that I had enough wood before making these cuts. Once all of the milling was done and I had my pieces ready to go, I traced that middle stretcher piece back onto the white oak and cut it out on the bandsaw. For this, I trace using a fine tip Sharpie, and then when I'm cutting it out, I try to just barely touch that line. It then leaves the perfect amount to take away with my router later. And that is the next step. I take the plywood template and use some painter's tape and CA glue to adhere the template to the white oak, and then use a top-bearing flush trim bit to take away some of the waste. I don't go over the joint sections here though, as it is such a scary cut on the router. I'll show you how I make the perfect joints shortly. Once I have about 3/4 of an inch taken away, I then flip the piece over and use the bottom-bearing flush trim bit to finish it off. To get all of the pieces ready to glue together, I create a temporary sled to cut all of the joint pieces on the front and back legs, as well as the backrest and stretcher piece. This takes a little time to set up for each component, but makes the glue up a lot easier and more reliable later on. Not to mention, these cuts on the table saw are way safer than doing it with the router. Once all of the joints were cut, I use my tapering jig to cut the front and back legs as well as the backrest pieces. Now all of my separate components are done and it's time to add some dominoes and get gluing. Each joint receives two 10mm by 50mm dominoes. With the mortises cut, I could begin the glue up process. I did it in a total of 3 separate glue ups, the front and back legs onto the stretcher, and then when it was dry, I added the backrest.
So in order to glue up the backrest, it was a bit of a challenge. So what I did was clamp these 2 pieces of walnut on here, and they are parallel with what this joint is. So that way I can slip my parallel clamp through here and then apply enough pressure coming down.
When the 2 sides were done, I marked the stretchers that will attach the 2 sides together and repeated the same last step as adding dominoes and then gluing it up. While the glue was drying, I switched my attention to getting the pieces ready for the armrests. The top piece was cut at 4 inches wide by 1 3/4 inches thick, and then the bottom pieces were cut at 3 inches wide by 1 3/4 inches thick. The bottom pieces I then gave a 15-degree angle to attach them to the stretchers. This was a bit much, and if I were to do this chair again, I would make them probably closer to 10 degrees. To attach the 2 components of the armrest together, I used some dominoes, and then to attach that structure to the chair, I used a dowel jig. I didn't want to hit any dominoes when I was power carving later on. Because I've never power carved anything before, and the teeth of that thing really do scare me, I decided I would use my router to give the edges a large round over before I attacked it with the angle grinder and cut saw disc. I used a 1/2 inch round over bit for all of the pieces I could get to, and then it was the moment of truth. Put on my glasses, respirator, and said my final words in case this went horribly wrong. Honestly, in the end, it was surprisingly easy to control, and while it leaves a really rough cut, it removes material quickly and easily. The one downside is that it creates more of a mess than my 3-year-old eating spaghetti, which is really tough to do. If it wasn't -20 here in winter, I honestly would have done this entire process outside. The more intricate and delicate parts of the carving were done on the armrests. They started really nice and thick, which gave me a lot of material to kind of work with and shape to get the shape that I wanted. If I was to do this chair again, I would have made the bottom piece of that armrest a little bit longer, as getting the cut saw disc into that back part was really challenging. Because I couldn't get far enough in with the grinder and the cut saw disc, I ran to Lee Valley and grabbed some wood rasps. These honestly worked really well for the small parts that I needed them for. Once all of the power carving was done, it was time to sand, and sand, and sand. I used a combination of an orbital sander with 100 grit paper to try and even things out as best I could, and then worked up through the grits. I also did a lot of hand sanding in those really awkward places that the sander couldn't reach. The final step was a bit of a last minute decision, and that was to put a groove for the leather to go in that top headrest kind of part. I was going to have the leather wrap all the way around the top piece, but after thinking about it, I felt it was going to make it look a little bit too boxy. So I used a 1/4 inch spiral bit to cut a slot in the top stretcher for the leather to eventually loop through. For finish, I mixed together some Rubio Monocoat cotton white and applied it generously to the chair, waited for about 15 minutes, and then rubbed off any excess. I really do love the look of the cotton white on white oak. It makes all of that grain pop really nicely. Now that all the woodworking aspects were done, I had a friend of mine who owns a small business selling amazing leather and canvas goods to do all the leather work for me. For the sling, she used a piece of black 5-ounce shoe leather. Her first step was to cut out the amount that she needed to use using a T-square. The piece ended up being about 20 inches wide by 60 inches long. This provided enough for the loop on the front and back stretcher, as well as having the sling sit at the proper level. Once the piece was cut to the right width and length, she then took a punch and started to make holes for where she would eventually use thread to stitch the leather piece together. With the holes all punched, she puts the leather back through that slot that I had cut and just makes sure that the sling is going to sit in the proper spot and double checking all of her measurements. With all of the holes punched, she then feeds that leather piece back through the slot and begins the long, tedious process of stitching it all together. She used a zigzag style stitch on this, and honestly, with the black thread, black leather, it couldn't have turned out better. I'm so happy with it. With the final stitch in place, it was time to bring the chair back inside and get some final pictures of it. This was my first power carving experience with the Cutsall disc, and honestly, I couldn't be happier with the way the chair turned out. Like I said earlier, please go take some time and check out Justin Nelson's work at Fernway Woodworking. This design was completely his, and I was just trying to copy it. The guy is an incredible designer and craftsman and does some incredible work, so definitely take the time to go check it out. If you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button and like, and even leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought. Thanks so much.